Welcome to Dialogue. We are diving into a detailed examination of high-stakes political tension, looking at a scenario where the division between federal and state power reaches a breaking point.
And it's a discussion we really have to approach with a genuine sense of gravity. Because the ideas we're exploring, they're usually just sensationalism or historical what-ifs.
Right.
The core insight we have to grasp is this. Civil conflicts, these jurisdictional fractures, they don't begin with grand declarations.
Not with armies lining up.
Not at all. They start small, they're localized, they begin with jurisdictional disputes, a slow, creeping loss of legitimacy, and this is crucial armed actors, so police, agents, guardsmen, who answer to different competing authorities.
Okay, let's unpack that. For this deep dive, our mission is strictly to analyze the mechanism of a constitutional crisis. We're setting aside the policy debates around immigration enforcement.
This isn't about left versus right.
It's exactly not about the merits of any specific policy. Our focus is purely on what happens when the federal enforcement apparatus, in this case an agency like ICE, loses its legitimacy in the eyes of state governments and their citizens. This reframes the whole thing from a political problem into a fundamental constitutional flashpoint.
That's the perfect way to put it, because history shows us civil conflict often masks itself as a constitutional crisis at first. The question isn't really about the policy, how many people are being deported.
That becomes secondary.
It becomes almost irrelevant. The true existential question is, who has the legitimate, unquestioned right to use force in a specific place? That monopoly on violence, that's the definition of sovereignty.
When two sovereigns claim that right over the same street corner.
That's when you have a crisis.
But doesn't the federal government have clear, binding legal precedent? I mean, the Supremacy Clause, isn't a state on pretty shaky legal ground when it obstructs a federal agency?
And that is the critical legal tension. Yes, the Supremacy Clause is very real, but a law depends on enforcement.
And enforcement depends on legitimacy.
Exactly. If a state government, backed by its own citizens, refuses to cooperate because it feels it's protecting its residents, well, the federal agency can only enforce its will by introducing more force.
Which just makes them look worse.
And once that force is used against state authorities, even if it's legally justified, it shreds the perception of legitimacy. The state might lose the legal argument in a courtroom, but it wins the moral and potentially the operational battle on the ground.
So let's establish that core tension. We have these two powerful, contradictory mandates that are just guaranteed to collide. And federal immigration enforcement is sitting right at that intersection.
The collision is baked into the system. It's inescapable because of the fundamental duties of each government. The federal authority, through DHS and ICE, is mandated to handle national security, border control, uniform enforcement of federal law.
That's their job.
It's their constitutional mandate. But at the same time, the states, through their governors, their police, their public health systems, hold the primary responsibility for the public safety and welfare of all their residents. Period.
And when federal enforcement and state safety become mutually exclusive, that's when force becomes the final arbiter.
Precisely. If a federal operation is seen by the state, and especially by its residents, as actively undermining local public safety, say, it makes people afraid to report crimes to local police, then the state has a powerful incentive to resist.
And if that resistance moves beyond the courtroom
and into physical obstruction, you have only two outcomes. Either one side backs down with incredible restraint, or the conflict escalates.
The thinking we're exploring is clear. ICE activity is the flashpoint. It's the trigger, even if it isn't the root cause of the fracture. And we've seen this pattern intensified ICE operations with little, sometimes zero, coordination with local police.
And when those operations lead to these highly visible, sometimes aggressive, or even fatal encounters, the speed at which public trust just evaporates it's astonishing.
That erosion of trust is the key. It's not about one single scandal.
No, it's the cumulative effect. It's a steady, constant pressure of incidents that collectively shift public perception. So the question becomes, are these federal agents still seen as impartial law enforcement? Or, in the eyes of state officials and the local population, are they transforming into an occupying force?
Let's dig into that phrase. What are the specific cues that accelerate, that jump from federal agent to occupying force?
It's visual, it's psychological, and it's operational. When federal agents operate from unmarked vehicles, the classic white vans or dark SUVs with no clear insignia, that immediately raises suspicion.
It feels covert, not official.
Exactly. And when their uniforms look more like combat gear than standard police attire, we're talking full tactical vests, helmets, maybe even camouflage, It invokes a military response in the public's mind. And crucially, if they refuse to visibly display clear identification, that anonymity just screams unaccountability.
So the look and feel of the operation, even if it's for agent safety, reads as hostile.
It reads as occupation. And immigration enforcement has this unique volatility that other federal operations, say the DEA or FBI, might not, just because of where it happens.
Or it touches civilian life.
Right. The FBI or ATF, they focus on specific locations, a bank, a crime scene, a remote lab. Immigration enforcement, by its very nature, happens in the most intimate, sensitive places.
The family home.
The family home, a school drop-off, the local workplace, the neighborhood street.
It doesn't just scratch the surface of a community, it rips right through its most vulnerable fabric.
And that's the consequence. It's deeply emotional. It involves families, mixed-status households, where citizens and non-citizens live together. It involves children watching their parents being detained. It's often perceived as racially charged, regardless of intent, just because of the demographics.
And there's no local accountability.
No immediate jury oversight, no local civilian complaint board like a city police department has. This combination, the intimacy, the emotional impact, and the lack of local oversight, creates this emotional mass for rapid escalation. And that mass becomes a fuel source just waiting for a spark.
So we have this situation of high emotional and political heat. How does that frustration move from standard political disagreement to an actual armed posture? Let's walk through the steps where a governor stops writing press releases and starts positioning armed personnel.
This transition is the absolute core of the deep dive. It's an escalation ladder. It starts with legal moves and moves almost inevitably toward physical confrontation.
Let's start with step one, political resistance. This is where the standard tension of federalism lives.
Right. This is the legal sparring phase. Governors condemn ICE actions loudly in the media. States refuse crucial cooperation.
Like refusing detainer requests.
Exactly. Cities declare sanctuary policies, and state attorneys general challenge federal authority in court. This is all standard, if tense, federalism.
Let's pause on that detainer request. Why is refusing that such a powerful yet standard tool of resistance?
That's a key piece of this. A federal detainer is a request. It's not a judicial warrant. ICE asks a local jail, hey, when this person is done with their local charges, hold them for an extra 48 hours so we can come pick them up.
And for a long time, local police just did it.
They did. But many state and local courts have ruled that complying with that request violates the Fourth Amendment because there's no probable cause warrant backing the detention.
So states are using the Constitution to argue they can't cooperate with a federal administrative request.
Precisely. They also argue it's an unfunded mandate. So when a state refuses, the local jail just releases the person. This forces ICE into much more difficult, dangerous, and visible operations in the community to find that person later.
Which leads right back to those emotional flashpoints we just talked about.
It's a cycle.
Okay, so if the pressure cooker of step one fails, we move to the really concerning part. Step two, security posture changes.
This is where it goes from arguments to men with guns. The critical shift is when states put their state police forces, state troopers, highway patrol on heightened alert.
And their initial deployment is framed innocently. Maintaining peace.
Or ensuring orderly traffic near federal activity. But the reality is, state police are now shadowing federal agents, and that is an enormous assertion of authority.
It's an assertion of sovereignty in action.
It is, and it quickly evolves into active surveillance. State police start monitoring federal checkpoints, patrol routes. They use local intelligence to track federal movements. They're essentially saying, you are on our turf, and we are watching everything you do.
What happens when they physically encounter each other? A traffic stop, for example.
That is the moment of maximum risk. A state trooper pulls over a vehicle they think is part of a federal operation. The trooper is asserting state law over that piece of highway. The federal mission doesn't matter to them in that moment.
And that's the tipping point for this step, isn't it?
It is. Once state police are physically positioned between the civilians they are protecting and the federal agents trying to conduct enforcement, the escalation ladder has already been climbed. You have two distinct armed sovereignties right next to each other.
And if that standoff doesn't resolve things, the governor is forced to play the state's biggest card. Step three, putting the National Guard on standby.
This is a signal of last resort. The state frames it publicly as defensive protecting critical infrastructure or preventing unrest, but its real function is far more direct.
Talk us through that power shift. What does that actually mean on the ground?
Deploying the Guard signals the state's readiness to assert state authority in the most organized way possible. Unlike police, the Guard is trained and equipped for combat. Mobilizing them puts organized armed forces under the direct command of the governor.
It creates a parallel chain of command.
An explicit one that runs directly counter to the federal structure. The state is effectively saying, we have a standing army that answers to us, and we are activating it because of your perceived aggression.
The implication is that a governor can mobilize military capacity that Washington normally assumes is on its side.
Yes. And the crucial clarification here is that the Guard does not need to fire a single shot to escalate the situation. Their visible presence alone changes every calculation. For the federal government, the risk of an accidental armed clash just went up tenfold. For armed civilian groups watching, the state just gave their cause a massive dose of legitimacy. The crisis is now a military political standoff, not a legal one.
So if the states are escalating like this, Washington has to respond. And as you said, the options are all terrible.
They're all lose-lose scenarios. The federal government has to choose between looking weak or looking tyrannical. There's not much middle ground left.
Let's start with federal option A. Ignore the states.
This is the path of stubborn legal assertion. ICE just keeps going, insisting on federal supremacy, assuming the states will eventually back down. They bet on the law.
But the long-term consequences seem devastating. State officials look weak if they don't follow through. Civilian anger just builds, and federal legitimacy keeps eroding.
And that's the structural failure. By ignoring the state, the federal government confirms the narrative that it's arrogant and heavy-handed. It fuels that occupying force perception. They might win the legal battle, but they lose the ability to actually govern.
Then there's the most dramatic response. Federal option B, federalize the National Guard.
This is the constitutional nuclear option. The president invokes the Insurrection Act, and with the stroke of a pen, transfers those state guard units from the governor's command to federal command.
It instantly strips the resisting governor of their main instrument of power.
And it is incredibly rare. We think of its modern uses during the Civil Rights era, Eisenhower in Little Rock, Kennedy in Alabama. Even then, when the legal and moral clarity was overwhelming, using federalized force left deep, lasting scars.
The legal justification doesn't stop the political trauma of seeing U.S. soldiers deployed against U.S. citizens on U.S. soil.
Not at all. And when that order to federalize is given, the outcomes are immediately destabilizing. First, you have an instant constitutional crisis. States sue, arguing the conditions for insurrection haven't been met.
And second, the loyalty of the guardsmen themselves.
That's the true fracture point. These are people whose oath is to their state constitution, whose loyalty is to their community and their governor. Are they going to point their weapons at their neighbors on a federal order they see as political overreach? Many might just say no.
Which is a recipe for mutiny.
It creates the conditions for it. And third, public perception shifts instantly and irreversibly. Federalizing the Guard is the clearest signal that this is no longer law enforcement. It's military occupation.
Okay, so if the feds fear that fragmentation, they might go for federal option C, deploy federal tactical units.
This is the high-visibility, rapid deployment option. We're talking about specialized federal forces, DHS tactical teams, Border Patrol's BORTAC, Deputy U.S. Marshals. And these deployments are characterized by heavy, military-style gear, often creating armed federal perimeters deep inside cities.
We've seen images of this before, agents in full camo, hard to identify. Why does the choice of which tactical unit they send matter so much?
It's all about the political message. If they send deputy marshals, the message is about enforcing the court system. But if they send BORTAC, a unit traditionally focused on border interdiction, the message is that the federal government sees the problem as an invasion or an insurrection. The visuals are profoundly different.
And when those teams are deployed into a resisting state, what is the functional crisis point?
The crisis point is the moment these units start asserting control over territory already claimed by the state. When a federal perimeter is set up around, say, a city block, and state police are ordered to patrol a perimeter just outside of that.
Then the United States begins to resemble two governments enforcing incompatible realities.
That's it exactly. One government says, this is federal sovereign territory, and the other says, you are violating the rights of our citizens on our land. The existence of competing armed perimeters marks the functional collapse of unified authority.
Up to now, we've mostly talked about government-on-government tension. But for this to become a true civil fracture, the people have to align with one side or the other. This is where the legitimacy collapse really happens.
And that's the difference between a political fight and a real conflict. Civil conflict doesn't need everyone to participate. It just needs enough people to stop recognizing a single binding authority.
So let's detail how civilian opposition moves from just protesting to organized resistance. What are the escalation markers?
It begins with community patrols. Civilians organize watch groups to warn of ICE presence. They track vehicles, use encrypted apps to coordinate. Their function is to blind the federal agency by taking away the element of surprise.
They're essentially turning the community into a networked self-defense warning system.
Exactly. The next step is physical intervention. They move from warning to actively blocking. They use their bodies to block federal vehicles. They create human shields.
Which forces federal agents into these direct physical confrontations with crowds?
And that gives the state government all the political cover it needs to intervene with its own forces to prevent violence.
And local officials would encourage this, framing it as community defense.
Of course. The local leadership provides the moral and political cover. This turns the resistance from disorganized chaos into organized resistance that feels legitimate because it's aligned with local democratic authorities.
This sounds like it guarantees retaliation from federal units, which brings us to the highest marker of political crisis.
It does. The critical shift is when federal agents start detaining or arresting local elected officials or community leaders, not just protesters. Imagine a mayor or a prominent organizer being physically seized by federal tactical units for obstruction.
The political class itself is now being arrested by the other sovereign authority. That is no longer a law enforcement issue.
That's the key takeaway. Once you start arresting legally elected officials who hold a democratic mandate, the conflict is no longer a protest. It's a fundamental assault on the political structure of the state. The federal government is effectively declaring the local government illegitimate.
Okay, if the two armed groups are positioned and the civilians are aligned, the only question left is how the first shot is fired. We have 4 specific pathways here that turn this crisis into an irreversible conflict.
And these pathways show that escalation is less about malice and more about uncontrolled physics. You put 2 highly stressed armed groups in close proximity, and the outcome is statistically predictable.
Let's start with the most frightening one, Pathway 1, the accidental clash.
This one is terrifying because it requires the least amount of intentional malice. Picture a high-tension scene. State police are at the head of a large protest, separating civilians from a federal perimeter. The federal agents attempt a high-profile arrest right at the state police line. There's noise, confusion.
Conflicting orders are being shouted.
Exactly. A federal agent, maybe fearing they're about to be overwhelmed, draws their weapon. A state trooper, seeing that as a threat to the civilians they're protecting, also draws their sidearm. Tensions are at a peak.
And that confusion, one misfire.
A nervous hand slips, a weapon accidentally discharges, and it hits a state trooper. And that's it.
That single unintended event ends any chance of de-escalation.
It means the first federal-state armed confrontation has happened. Once blood is shed between uniformed agents of opposing sovereigns, no one can de-escalate. The demand for justice or revenge on both sides, amplified instantly by social media, makes retreat impossible for the leaders.
Next, Pathway 2, the arrest crisis. This is a constitutional game of chicken.
This one is about political audacity. A state attorney general issues an arrest warrant for a federal agent involved in a questionable operation. The federal authorities refuse compliance, citing supremacy.
They're daring the state to execute its own warrant.
Precisely. And in retaliation to assert dominance, federal agents arrest a higher-ranking state official, the mayor who's organizing the resistance, maybe even the governor. They seize the official and take them to a federal facility.
That is the ultimate act of constitutional disrespect.
The cracking point is reached because once elected officials are arrested by another sovereign authority, the union is already functionally broken. The separation is complete. The state now views the federal government as having launched a political coup against its leadership.
The third pathway involves the state's own military. Pathway 3, guard fragmentation. This happens after the president invokes the Insurrection Act.
This is that loyalty conflict we talked about playing out. The president federalizes the Guard, but due to intense polarization or loyalty to the governor, some Guard units, maybe an entire brigade, refuse the federal orders. They declare loyalty to the governor. Other units comply.
So the state's own armed forces fracture.
The chain of command breaks down overnight. and this is incredibly dangerous. The refusing units still have their arms, their bases, their equipment, and civilian militias and armed groups immediately align themselves with the local guard forces refusing federal authority. The state military becomes a political actor.
Finally, Pathway 4. Geographic polarization. This is less about one clash and more about regional consolidation.
This pathway recognizes that the country is already deeply polarized. Certain states openly resist federal authority, while other states actively support it.
So you get these pockets of resistance and compliance that are geographically connected. What does that do to daily life?
It means the fundamental glue holding the union together, the legal and commercial infrastructure, breaks down. Interstate cooperation collapses. A warrant from a prosecutor in New York might be ignored by police in Florida. Commercial trucking licenses issued in Texas might be deemed invalid in California.
It creates a kind of economic and legal balkanization.
Absolutely. The fragmentation hits travel, commerce, law enforcement. Civil conflict doesn't need to be everywhere at once. It just needs regional consolidation of authority, where one contiguous area decides its laws supersede the federal government's. The map starts looking like a patchwork quilt of incompatible laws.
Analyzing these pathways makes it terrifyingly clear that the structural elements for this kind of conflict are here. But why is this moment uniquely dangerous compared to, say, the federalism battles of the 1960s?
We have several modern accelerators that make everything far more flammable. First, social media. It accelerates mobilization and spreads conflicting narratives instantly. A single body cam video taken out of context can mobilize hundreds of armed people before a governor can even issue a statement.
There's no time for the news cycle to verify the facts. The community is already acting on a viral stream. That speed is a game changer.
It is a massive accelerant. Second, we have an established, organized, and equipped armed civilian culture that is highly sensitive to federal overreach. These groups aren't starting from scratch. They're a ready-made third force waiting to align with a state authority that resists Washington.
And third, there's the psychological factor of institutional trust.
And that's maybe the most profound factor. Trust in major national institutions, the government, the courts, the media is at a historic low. When trust is low, people are far more likely to believe the worst-case scenario about federal actors and align with local resistance.
And the federal agencies themselves are already perceived as politicized.
Precisely. So when you put all that together, the key takeaway is this. The United States doesn't need a traditional rebellion anymore. It just needs a legitimacy collapse. The government buildings can still be standing, but the consensus on who has the right to govern is gone.
So is this inevitable? Or are there real, viable off-ramps to pull the system back from this brink?
The outcome is not inevitable. Civil conflict begins when force replaces the consent of the governed. So de-escalation requires active, intentional steps to rebuild that consent.
What does that look like in practice?
It means hard, negotiated limits. First, clear, transparent limits on federal enforcement in sensitive areas, schools, hospitals. Second, a real process for state-federal negotiation to resolve these disputes before anyone picks up a gun.
There has to be robust, accountable transparency for all federal actions.
Yes. Agents must be clearly identifiable. Their use of force must be reviewed by impartial bodies. And fourth, the removal of that heavy militarized presence from civilian flashpoints. If an operation can only be done with heavy tactical gear, its political cost has to be reevaluated.
And the final piece? Bringing it back to the Constitution.
The courts have to regain their authority. They must be used to resolve these conflicts before either side resorts to force. When the legal process is seen as viable and functional, the incentive to use physical force diminishes.
Which brings us to the final, provocative thought to leave you with. If federal power keeps pushing these boundaries, and states decide that protecting their citizens matters more than obeying Washington, the fracture won't look like 1861 with marching armies.
It will look like normality until the moment it isn't. The country fractures quietly, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. The system will appear functional even as the center becomes completely irrelevant to those localized realities.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.